Hello, and welcome to Cry Havoc Wargaming, dedicated to bringing you the uncommon. For those who haven't met me, my name is Ron, and today we're going to do a review of TT Combat's Carnevale. So let's get started. Carnevale is a game that was originally produced by Vesperon Games out of Spain. It was taken up by TT Combat, I think it was 2 years ago now. It's not a new game. It's originally a Kickstarter when it was done by TT Combat. They reworked the rules. They made a lot of changes in them, simplified them a great deal, and I think in the end improved them. But what is Carnevale? Carnevale is an absolutely beautiful game set in an 18th century Venice, but not our Venice. Rather, it is an alternate reality Venice. The sky rips open with a magical rent, changing forever the nature of the city. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about the rent. If you're that interested, you can read about it in the rules. But a lot of things happen in the fluff to describe it all. The best way to describe what the game ends up being, then, is it is a skirmish game of Carnival mayhem in 18th century Venice. It relies on a number of different sources to give its feel. Some of the members of the guild are clearly inspired by Assassin's Creed. The Rashar are clearly inspired by Lovecraft. There are vampires that come from the typical vampire lore. So a number of different ideas came together to form this idea. Some inspiration from games like Malifaux, very much like that, except 18th century. But you're basically taking part in violence for various objectives, a number of different factions in 18th century Venice. Probably the game's biggest strengths, as well as its biggest weakness, is the fact that it is set in Venice. It is a requirement of that game, and this game is just absolutely stunning when it's put together well. The figures are all 32 millimeter resin casts, very well sculpted, interesting poses. They paint really well. You have to assemble them. They're multi-part figures, but they have a lot of character and a lot of beauty on their own. The city of Venice, of course, is the important thing. It really is what brings and makes this game different than other games. It's also, like I said, one of its big negatives. One of the biggest comments I've heard by people not wanting to get involved in the game is Venice. Not many people have usable terrain laying around their house for 18th century Venice. That isn't such a big difficulty as you may imagine. The two starter kits, there's two starter kits now, the original starter kit, and then a smaller abbreviated one, which is Escape from San Cassiano or something like that. The smaller one has a few smaller figures. It has a smaller version of the rule book, but both of them come with canal tiles and cardstock buildings, so you can get yourself started pretty quickly. TT Combat, of course, also makes MDF buildings, and they sell those in some bundles as well. And the table is small. For a common game, some of the games are only 2x2. But usually it's about 3x3 table. If you're playing with multiple factions, you may want a 4x4 table, but you're still talking a pretty small area, and half of it's canal. So not as hard as it sounds. As long as I'm talking about the beauty of the game, there's a number of cards. They're all optional. There's cards with the magic spells on them, and there's agenda cards. And again, those things are in the book. You don't need these cards, but the cards are just absolutely lovely and beautiful things to look at. Character cards, on the other hand, aren't available for the game. They come with that starter kit to help you get started, but other than that, they don't have pre-printed cards. There is an app on the TT Combat page that lets you print up either a roster list or cards for the characters you want for the games you want. A number of us have suggested that we would like to have them print cards. They have been, by they I mean TT Combat. TT Combat has avoided printing the cards on a regular basis because they want to keep the game alive and they want to be able to make alterations and change to fix some of the point differences or to work on balance issues without making you need to go out and buy all new cards. It's one of these living rules systems, I suppose, after a fashion. So what is the game? I mentioned it consists of a number of different factions. Usually you have maybe 6 characters on the table fighting another 6 characters. These factions divide into the guild. These are the average citizens of the area of Venice. That's They're closest things to being good guys in the game, which is saying a lot because it originally starts as a thieves guild. The capo, the main character that comes with the starter set, is clearly based on the assassin in Assassin's Creed. So not generally what you would think of as good guys. The way to look at the guild is kind of the way the mafia works in some parts of Sicily, where yes, they're committing crimes and they're illegal, but they also act as sort of the security and the policing organization for the local neighborhoods. And that's very much the way the guild works in the game. One of the things they're protecting the normal people from is the faction, the patricians. The patricians are basically bored nobles' children who have nothing better to do with their time than to go to decadent parties, get themselves drunk, and then go out onto the streets in masks, killing the innocent. It's a blood sport. They're pretty nasty individuals in that fact. So the guild is helping to protect normal people from people like that. But that isn't the only danger facing you in Carnevale. The water itself holds the Rashar. The Rashar are one of the two sets that come in the two basic sets. The basic set comes with the guild and the Rashar. And the Rashar are very much inspired by creatures from Lovecraft. They have slaves that they use to replenish their health points. There are some hybrids that are half human, half people, and then there's the Church of Dagon. There's the Vatican. The Vatican are the representatives of the new church. I say new church, the new Vatican, because the event that creates the rent also destroys Rome. The Vatican has actually moved to France. Strigoi is Vlad Dracul and his vampires who have come to get stronger and to learn more about his powers, frankly. Probably the evilest organization are the Doctors, Il Doctore. The Doctors originally had good intentions. They created an asylum on one of the islands of Venice for the mentally insane. But with the coming of the rent, they've started to discover that madmen have a large amount of mystical, magical power. And the doctors, who are very, very steampunk in feel, they have become driven by researching and learning about this power and learning to control it. So they now hunt the city for patients who may or may not need their aid to use as servants to supply the powers that they crave. Those are the basic factions. Beyond that, there's the Gifted. The Gifted can be played as a faction. In fact, there's a box set, which is the Commedia dell'arte. These are Commedia actors who have become, with the rent, they've actually become their characters and have special abilities that they have gathered or gained that are based on their characters. And that's really the secret of the Gifted. Most of these people we're talking about, with the exception of the creatures that are the Rashar and the vampires, obviously, but the others are people. But the Gifted are more like superheroes or mutants in a more modern world. The coming of the rent has given them various special abilities and changed them in magnificent, huge ways, not subtle things at all. So they can be like the Commedia as a faction on their own, but they're also hireable by the different factions to help support and strengthen. And some of them will work with any faction, some will not. That varies with each of the Gifted. So that's the basic characters. This is the feel of the game. I hope I have a good explanation of it. It's kind of hard to wrap up all of the information, the details that make up Carnevale. In fact, the normal rule book, the deluxe rule book, is only a few pages of rules. The game is actually pretty simple. The book is mostly background fluff, explaining the situation, what created the rent, and the various factions that make up the rent. So, the game mechanics. The game consists of usually one faction playing against or fighting another one. It'll have various objectives. Those may be claiming certain things on the board. It might be capturing each other or something like that. What's really interesting about the scenarios, there's a handful of basic scenarios that you can play with anybody in any faction. But then they have a bunch of mini campaigns, and those are each divided for each of the factions in the game. So there are faction-specific little campaigns in the back of the book. That is a really nice touch, I think, which I don't see in a lot of other rule books. Of course, it does make that rule book bigger and bulkier. I should probably mention how the dice work. The dice are all 10-sided dice. There's a series of dice. You can use any 10-sided dice, or you can buy the ones that are made specifically for the games. The starter set I keep talking about, which comes with dice, but there's also a generic dice pack that's for the game in general, and then each of the factions have their own, if you really want to get into that. The dice are all D10s. The official dice are marked in a different color for every number over 7. That's because an unopposed roll, 7 is always a success in the game. And then the symbol for 10 is the San Marco lion. 10 is the highest, 1 is the lowest. Now, in a set of dice, they're going to be all one color with the exception of your destiny dice. And the destiny dice are going to be what determines whether a die roll is a critical or a fumble or just a normal die roll. It's a little more complicated than how most games would work. Say you were trying to jump from one building to another. And that's something you're going to find you do a lot in this game. The game being inspired by things like Assassin's Creed, it expects you to use the terrain. Many of these characters can do phenomenal leaps. They can climb up buildings. It goes even under the board. So people are coming up off the board. They're going under the board with diving, particularly the Rashar. But it's not unusual to have characters like the Capo bouncing from roof to roof to roof and then dropping down to slay his opponent. So let's say you wanted to do that. You wanted to jump from one roof to another. You're going to make a jump roll. And a jump roll consists of rolling dice based on your dexterity. So let's say you have 5 dexterity. That means 5 dice. Always, whether it's 1 die or 6 die, one of those dice has to be the destiny die. So in a case of 5, you're going to have 4 are the colored dice, 1 destiny die, and you roll them and you're looking for 7s. 7 is in an unopposed roll is always an ace, as they call it, or a success. You just count all of the dice that are 7s or higher, and the destiny dice don't matter at that point. But where the destiny dice come into play is if you have the ability to re-roll dice, you can never re-roll a destiny dice. And the destiny I mentioned earlier determine critical successes or fumbles. If you have a lion or a 10 on the destiny die, and you have at least 1 other success, that is a critical. Where it's a little different than other games is having it on the destiny die alone is not good enough. And if you're only rolling 1 die, that's going to be the destiny die, and you cannot get a critical. The fumbles work kind of the opposite of that. The fumble is when you roll a 1 on the destiny dice and you have no other successes. So you could roll a fumble on 1 die. But as long as you have 1 success on another die, that's not going to be a fumble. And those will affect the success. For instance, in the case of the jump. A jump, you get 2 inches of jump plus 1 inch for each of your aces. And it'll give you extra inches if you rolled a critical, or it'll drop you to your possible doom if you fumble. That's how the basic die rolling works. I say basic because that's an unopposed roll. Attacks are done a little differently. Instead of having a required 7 for a success, when you're rolling an attack, it is going to be your opponent's dexterity that is your target number. So usually it's easier to fight people than it is to make these jumps and do these unopposed rolls. And then what they actually call an opposed roll in the game are things like grappling. With grappling, you actually are both rolling your dexterity dice looking for 7s, and the player that has the most aces wins the roll. That's how the dice work. What I've grabbed here is the Noble Strigoi card. He's a leader. So it has a picture of the figure on the one side. Across the top it has the special game stats. Those are the number of actions that he has. In this case it's 3. Most characters have 2 actions. It is his life points. That's how much damage he can take. In this case it's 13. He has will. It's usually used by the magicians and people who can do magic, and it's what inspires that magic. There's some exceptions. There's some other people and other ways of using it. The madmen carry it acting as batteries to supply the magic that the doctors use, for instance. And then some of the characters, including any of the leaders, have what's called command, which is what you use for initiatives. Also, there's a few different characters have some command abilities they can do where you expend one of those command points and it activates the item. All the factions have a command feature that's true, are valid to all of them. And then there's things you can do with them besides that. You can add an extra action to a character. You can interrupt with 1 action some other character. So a number of choices you can do to use those. But every time you do that, you lower them and they do not come back. So that lowers your chance of getting the initiative in the game. The next number on the top there is the size base. Different size creatures are on different size bases. That's a pretty standard idea. And then there's the cost of the character in ducats. That's how they do the points in the game. Below that they have the character stats. Move, the number of inches they move on an action. the dexterity, which is used, like I said, for defense when being attacked. The attack, the score you roll when you're attacking somebody else. Protection, that's a sort of a saving throw you do based on your ability to resist damage. And mind, which is used for various, again, spells. It's often the target of the spell you're trying when you're affecting mind or looking at control. Underneath that box is the list of the weapons that the character is carrying and any stats or how it affects normal attacks. On the left side, underneath the character's picture, there are keywords. Those describe certain things, like characters typically are leaders, heroes, or henchmen. So it's what level of character they are. Can have more heroes in a faction than you have henchmen. It'll include what factions they are. Below that will be a number of special abilities that help make the characters different. Like many of them have expert offense with a number, and that's how many dice they can re-roll when making attacks. So various things like that to change them up and make them a little bit different from each other. The stat you use for determining initiative is going to be that command stat. All the leaders have a command. You pick the one with the highest. You roll that number of dice. Let's say it's 4. You're going to roll 3 of the regular dice and 1 destiny dice. And whichever side ends up with the highest number of aces has the initiative of the turn. And they choose one of their characters to activate. And then they get that many action points based on what's on their card. Action points are used for the typical things you expect in games. Normal moves, there's climbs, there's jumps, rowing gondolas. There's, of course, attacks. There's they don't separate melee and missile fire in this game, which is kind of confusing to a lot of people. And all attacks are attacks. If you move into base-to-base contact, and that's important because there is, as I said, no melee. And some weapons have longer ranges than others, but this is always base to base, regardless of what your range of your weapon is. If you move into base-to-base contact, you get a free action, an opportunity attack. So that can increase the number of actions you have. There's also a clever little chain jump move. You can only do once per activation, but you can use an activation to jump onto the railing of a bridge or a barrel or some obstacle. And if you make your jump successfully onto it, you then get a free jump off of it to something else. So you can like stretch out your move by an extra action. You can only do that once per action, but it again allows you to do that bouncing and streaming along. And it's unusual. I don't know many games. I don't know of any game other than this that does that. Magic varies a little bit. It's usually using your mind stats. The different spells all work differently. Spells are divided into various schools of magic. The mages are all rated 1, 2, or 3, and that's how many spells you can take. The games usually have a limited number of turns that you're trying to achieve your goals and objectives in, and you get certain points for that. I mentioned agendas. That's an optional rule. It is sort of secondary objectives. A lot of them are a little gamey. The cards are beautiful, they help. They sometimes can be deciding points of a game, but they don't tend to be things like in Muskets and Tomahawks. You get these side missions that actually sound like something you might do. Your Indians may have a goal of destroying this guy's field or something. The agendas in Carnevale feel a little gamish to me. They tend to be things like get 3 people 6 inches off the ground up onto the buildings, or do so many damage to opponents only with your henchmen. So it's interesting. It helps keep the game interesting. It changes up what it can do, but it is also a little gamey. It doesn't feel like real goals and objectives that you would actually have. I've been playing this game for a while. I didn't participate in the Kickstarter. I did the backer kit right after. I wish I had done the Kickstarter. I was like a day late. I think it's a very enjoyable game, and I suggest it highly to anyone looking for something a little bit different. It's a lot different than a lot of other games. It's beautiful, striking tables. I get a lot of comments on any game show or convention where I put this game up. Don't let the issue of the terrain scare you like it does many. Go ahead and give it a try. If you know somebody in the area, if you go to the Facebook page, there's a map there. I think there's a map on the Facebook page. There's definitely a map on the TT Combat forum where you can find people maybe in your area that play. I don't think the game is that big here in the United States. It's certainly not where I'm at. Very colorful game, a lot of fun, interesting gameplay and mechanics, and I've never had anyone play it and not enjoy it. So it's if you get a chance to play it somewhere, I recommend it. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask them in the comments down below. If you've played this game yourself and you have comments you'd like to make about the game, either pro or con, go ahead and do that in the comments as well. Also, we ask if you have any ideas for further content you'd like to see here on Cry Havoc Wargaming. We ask you put those in the comments as well. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit like. And if you'd like to continue to receive notifications, to receive information on videos such as this one, to help you determine how you could spend your money or wargaming time, please hit subscribe. Until next time, cheers.